want to hear your thoughts on the forum. What do you think it has achieved? Second of all, has anything been addressed through the forum in the line of the hardship money? Because I know that people that might have a small farm might be working, and then because you're working, you're kicked out the door. In the line of the badgers and the deers, we know that, look, I've seen it myself lately, where there was 8 or 9 deers 8 or 9 years ago, and a guy went down with TB, and they were got rid of at the time. We have to control the, and we're not saying, and that people that's looking in understand this, we're not saying you get rid of every deer in the country, but no more than a population or whatever, if you let things run wild and loose for all your life, they take over a country. So like, everything in moderation, even moderation itself. So like, we need to make sure that there's a certain amount of a cull every year, especially in the black spots. And there's a new deer coming down our country that I think originates from this pygmy deer, is landed into places, which is actually causing more, as well as maybe the TB side of it. They're frightening the daylights because then I had to jump out where they came in. Forestry, what's your views on it, guys? Do you think that there's a sort of, the two things are running hand in hand? Now, there's one question, and I'd like your thoughts on it. I have seen people that have been zero grazing over the last maybe 2 or 3 years, and said the cows wouldn't be going out at all, and large parts of their herds have gone down, which is baffling. I don't know, is it on the fresh grass coming in that the problem is, or whatever? I'm just asking, have you any research done on that? And the other part of it is, we keep hearing there's plenty of money for destocking, but on the other side of it, I know one farmer that lost 40 cows, and then there was 16 more, and when you have to cut to the chase sooner or later and decide if you're going to take it out, because if you have cows, for example, and you're coming this time of year and the lint you have to stay destocked, you have to be looking at next year, to put it simple. Are you going to be back in milk or not, or are you going to be back at wherever you're at? And they seem to be dragging the feet that Dublin has to decide, and Dublin is getting the blame for it, that they're not coming with the money. But are ye hearing that, facing that, or is there clear decisions being made around the country? And look, that's all. In the line of the testing, I'd agree with Deputy Cahill, but there's a lot of uncertainty. You could send an animal to a factory or whatever, and they could be told that legions, even though they were clear in a test. And then you could have something that went in and nothing showed up, and then a few months later. It's very, for farmers, to be honest about it, a lot of them just cannot get their head around what's going on with the whole TB scenario. Thanks.
Thanks, Deputy. We'll start with ICSA this time and work our way back down. If you might address some of the points that were made.
Thanks, Chair. Deputy Cahill. I have numerous questions here. Selling young stock into feedlots, that is an issue of Brahop, because a lot of them only is worth a very small value, but the feedlots is buying them in, it's only buying strong cattle that's going to finish within 90 days or 100 days, so they're having a big risk. So these ones here are taking the full risk. So a compensation like what you're talking about there needs to be put in place where they're valued and sold in as if they were going down a reactor into a feedlot status. Or on the other hand, maybe a compensation in place for feeding the remaining cattle on the farm if they're young like cattle like that, in the event of a suckler herd or calf to store stage, because they're having the option of selling on. So preferably it'd be a compensation on going to a feedlot status and value them the same as a reactor. The live valuation, I suppose, it was a great system when it was brought in, and in the last few years why to change it. And I think that at the forum we got a lot of resistance. It's more at the bilateral meetings, and they're defending it. So to us, like there's, as we mentioned there, there's up to $500,000 maybe spent just gathering information. If valuers comes out there and they're qualified people doing their job, like yourselves or anyone else doing a job, they're able to do their job that they're licensed to do it or whatever it may be. Well, that should be acceptable. We have to accept it as farmers in the market when we're selling for us or whoever else. So the department shouldn't be questioning their thing there. They're questioning the capability of them people as a trader or value. So we shouldn't be tolerating that, in fairness. And it's costing far more of the taxpayer than it is realising it's actually not gaining money for them. The badger vaccination there and testing. The vaccination, seemingly at the present time, it's in certain counties. It was supposed to have maybe contributed a bit to the outbreak in Monaghan. We're not sure on that one, but it was mentioned at the time. But the vaccine there has been given to the badgers there that they snared. Then a vet has tried to come out then to give it some and maybe give an anaesthetic in case someone get hurt. That needs all to be addressed, but the vaccine that they're giving them is not within the EU. If it was, then anybody could give the vaccine, and a proper maybe cage or something for doing it. It quite a lot of costs, save a lot of expense, and maybe more appropriate. But the biggest thing is by doing the vaccination there, and maybe them getting an anaesthetic is, they're left there to recover if it's cold winter weather or some hypothermia can set in, and maybe they die occasionally, some of them. Well, if they're after getting a live vaccine, then the cattle around them can pick up. And this is a worry in one sense. So we don't know enough on it. And another thing is, given a live vaccine, is our biggest fear is that the badger itself has never been tested. So we don't know whether they are carrying the disease or not. So if you're given a live vaccine on top of the disease, are you spreading it further? So I don't know whether that's a good idea or not. You know, like, on the cull there, on the deer, you mentioned there on the deer, now we're pushing hard on the deer in a long time. But it's time, like there's 3.5 million there going through the TB forum there to wildlife. Now, the wildlife never sat at the forum at any stage. So they never spoke for themselves, their department spoke for them on that end of it. Thus, there needs to be responsibility taken by us as ICSA, needs to be responsibility taken there, that they'll control the number of deer, number one in the country, regardless of disease. But number two is that this thing is spreading disease, and as we're hearing around the store there tonight, around the table here, it's accounted everywhere for contributing, like a Clare, Tip, Cork, even down Mayo or whatever. So that has to be taken into, and as we spoke earlier on there, there has to be a project on the same as Offaly on the badger, and identify it and deal with the issue. And as of Owen, I think the department has to take onus to it and take responsibility. On the 3 or 4%, yeah, clear herd there. Now, what you were talking about there, like somebody gets, it's a breakdown and have 2 clear herd tests, well, automatically then have 6 months to the next test. This was always what they believed, every farmer. Nowadays, it's you could know one man in particular where in November he went clear. January he got no letter stating that he'd have a test by the 3rd of February, but he had until the 3rd of July. But once the 3rd of February came, his herd was automatically locked down again. His income supplement was cut off, because he was classed as a clear herd, even though he didn't get a 6-month break. So a 6-month break and 2 clear tests was always the warden for a clear herd. So as far as that goes, the herd has to be identified, and it has to, that status has to be removed. Either you're clear or you're not clear, because it's riding people's income. They tell you have a window 2 or 3 months to sell. In his case, it was Christmas time, early January, there was no sales. You go there and the price is bad. So that's not realistic. So we have to look at that, and we have to go back to where it was. I don't know where that law came in out of. It's not one of the regular books anyhow. The carry the law cost of pre-movement, I would totally agree with you on that one, and we'll be pushing that further. Now, Senator Daly, on the TB forum there, I thought it was valuable enough to a certain extent, to be honest with you. It opened maybe different views or doors, but we found as the time went on, and maybe you'll elaborate more on this, is there was a lot of different groups around the table. Different people had vested interest in it. But what we found as far as compensation came, or real issues, there was only a certain element of people was actually putting money out of their pocket into this. And that was either the farmer or the department or EU. So why had we veterinary and so many different wildlife, forestry, you name it, or be whatever else around the table, where they were actually putting nothing into the programme? And they were able to help determine the status of where we were going in our programme, in the forum. So I think that needs to be addressed too, that it's tightened up, that more people can have a say on that issue, and we'll be able to continue on that. Do you want to elaborate on that, Eddie?
Well, look, what we would just say is that we think the forum was useful, but there was about 18 different groups around the table, and we think it should be reconvened to discuss cost, benefit analysis, on-farm market valuation, etc., and indeed to go back to the wildlife issue. But really, this is a matter for farm organisations to thrash out with the department to some considerable extent. And, you know, look, I would agree on several of the points. Off-farm income being taken into account on hardship grant, and a limit of 250 is just unacceptable. The idea that someone, if they are locked up for the winter, doesn't have a substantial additional feed cost. I mean, yes, they do. And if they have just some small off-farm income, that's not a reason why they haven't, to say that they haven't been impacted by the breakdown. So look, the TB forum, I think, you know, has been a useful exercise. Our view is that a lot of the decisions made eventually were not, there was no proper, I think, definition of how we would arrive at decisions. So at a lot of those meetings, there was no consensus, or the views of people who didn't have skin in the game was being taken into account in a way, in our view, that shouldn't happen. The farmers were paying a substantial part of the bill, and their view, I think, should have had more weight in it. So we'd ask a few questions about who gets to actually, you know, you had a scenario where, for example, outside expert opinion might be useful to the forum, but it should not be a voting part of the forum.
Just to follow up on that for a second there, is going back to TV forum there for a minute. You see, initially, I suppose it was brought in on disease eradication, and there's a lot of time put in, maybe that a professor there from the UCD, and there was different issues, and it's all based on Australia and categorisation and the MART boards, and this was the way forward, and this was, the message was coming out every day that came at different angles. There was too much time maybe spent at that, instead of saying, well, look at the farming house isn't interested in this, farmers, it's not suitable for the farmers in this country, and move on. We spent too many days and too many times at repeating ourselves, and I think there was a lot of time lost there. And something we're never going to make ground on, because it wasn't workable. You know, we're two different numbers, like as ranches against farms, that's the difference. So it couldn't work. So I think that's what a lot of the downfall was there, insistent or consistent, pushing it to a further level to try and bring it through. So that was that. But it's just like Michael's thing there on the forestry. Yeah, the forestry there, fencing, like there's a grant there for fencing forestry, and normally it's only maintained for about the first 5 years for that. That forestry should be maintained the whole way through, and especially at felling too, because wildlife moves, and like it covers even sheep fencing for small wildlife and everything for transferring over and back on farms. And I think that should be compulsory. Like it should be, like they're able to farm subs and maybe a lot of these farms, and that maintenance of a hard boundary should be scrutinised the same as any other farm, and addressed on a forestry, in my belief. And the zero grazing, there was a farm in Offaly there where they lost a lot of cows, and the maintenance, the wildlife travelling it, and that animal, if it was grazing it, has choice of where to eat, where they don't when it's coming in as a zero grazer. It's cutting all and bringing it in, so I think that's the biggest end of it. But, and furthermore, as Eddie said there about the hardship grant, that's something we have to remove, because like even at 250, as Eddie said, it's, in today's world of finance, it's of no value to any farmer, and then they take it and put in income supplement or income of an off-farm income into it. It's totally out, so that has to be removed from it as far as we are concerned. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. Mr. Burke.
Thanks very much, Chairman. I suppose the first question that we've been asked that I'll deal with is in relation to the TB Forum, raised both by Senator Daly and Deputy Fitzmaurice, as to what the IFA view on the forum is. And just to maybe give a little background in advance of the answer, Chairman, when the Minister announced he was launching or setting up a TB Forum, IFA identified the key issues that had to be addressed in the TB Forum for farmers in advance of the forum being established. And fundamental to that was addressing the shortcomings in the compensation schemes, which includes the hardship grant, the income supplement scheme, the live valuation scheme. Because whilst the objective is, yes, to protect the 97% of herds that don't have TB, it cannot be at the cost of imposing a higher cost burden on the 3% unfortunate to have it. And this feeds into how we solve the problem. We solve the problem by looking after the 3%, focusing the energies and the resources there and supporting them in through that, not by stigmatising their animals or their herds by categorising them and half opening the gate, Deputy, to allow them maybe trade with some farmers and not trade with others. The onus is on the Department of Agriculture to rid the disease from that farm, which is back to what Deputy Cahill mentioned earlier, and then allow free trade. But from an IFA perspective, the view of the TB Forum is that it has failed farmers because it has failed to address the key areas on behalf of farmers. Furthermore, because of that, it has failed to put forward reasonable or necessary control changes to attain the aspirational or the ambitious date of 2030. And if we look at the interim report that has been published by the Forum, there are only 2 recommendations in it that are referred to as significant policy changes, and one of those is continuing the wildlife programme, which is already in existence. So the clear view of IFA, having discussed in detail the document put forward and the approach of the forum, and having flagged well in advance of the forum being established, is that it has failed farmers in the key objectives. Just to maybe answer a few more points Deputy Daly asked or Senator Daly asked in relation to what would be the most effective change that we would see, or how would we see this moving forward. And there are 2, Senator Daly, where we see that there has been a lack of focus, and one is proactively preventing outbreaks being caused by wildlife. That includes both deer and badger, which are being disturbed throughout the country through road developments, through wind farms, through forestation, through deforestation, Deputy. The wildlife are being disturbed, they're being stressed, they're causing outbreaks downstream where they're moving into. We see farms throughout the country every year having new outbreaks as a result. If we're serious about eradicating TB, then we have to stop new outbreaks occurring. And the department must focus proactively in these areas and reduce the density of wildlife that are clearly susceptible to TB and infecting our farms. The second part is heavily dependent on the Department of Agriculture actually investing in what they believe to be the solution. And the real concern for farmers in this, Chairman, is that the Department have put forward proposals where they tell us we'll achieve eradication by 2030. And if the Department are as confident as we are in their proposals, then why do they not invest in the short term in supporting the farmers that their proposals will impact on? Because everybody will accrue a benefit in the longer term if these proposals are to be so successful. But they need to go further. And if there is problems and ongoing difficulties in farms and in areas that have a poor history, then these farms need to be fully supported and helped farm their way through this, not by stigmatising them in the marketplace, not by de-restricting them, which will reduce then their eligibility for support payments, and restricting them again 3 months later, which means that the slate is wiped clean and the state have a significant saving in compensation. And it's the same issue in relation to depopulation. We have ongoing outbreaks in farmers who are restricted for significant periods of time, de-restricted, restricted again, and there's a continual refusal to depopulate these farms. Let these men clean out, disinfect and get back to normal farm practice. And unfortunately, it seems to be finance that's making that decision rather than the veterinary view, because nobody could say that the department are successfully addressing the TB outbreak that is continuing for 2 or 3 years, maybe with a 2 or 3 month window of de-restriction in that. TB is not being addressed on that farm. That farmer is being held to ransom by the failure of the Department of Agriculture, and that's not acceptable. If that disease is in those animals, then they all need to be taken out and let the man restock and kick off again. In relation to the zero grazing, I'm actually aware of the herd owner, Deputy, that's had a depopulation in your area in relation to that farm practice, and it may or may not be a contributing factor. But the ultimate issue here is whether that herd owner was zero grazing or not. There was obviously TB in the vicinity, if it was to be brought in, or if the wildlife got access to where the animals were being fed. And obviously zero grazing is merely replicating what happens for 6 months every winter, where
Just to be clear, I am saying that there is instances in areas. I'm not particularly picking on one person.
No, understand, Deputy, but the point I'm making is that what zero grazing effectively is replicating 6 months of the winter feeding for 12 months. But it all comes back to the fact that obviously there is infected wildlife in the area, and it may make the outbreak worse because the animals are in a confined space for a longer period of time. But it comes back to the same point, addressing the issue in the wildlife, reducing the density to reduce the interaction with the cattle and to reduce the risk of a breakdown. Just to pick on a few points that Deputy Cahill made, because I agree with the number of them, Deputy, but I would just make one or two observations. In relation to the young stock being sold to feedlots, this is part of that. There's two impacts on farms effectively in a TB outbreak. Either one is the restriction, which results in additional animals being maintained, which adds enormous cost and difficulty to the farm, and the second is where significant numbers of animals have been removed and there's a significant income loss. In relation to where there's additional animals being retained, the IFA proposal is that the hardship grant scheme would recognise the additional costs associated with that and support the farmer through it, allowing the farmer then to make the choice as to whether or not he sells the animals at a significantly reduced rate to the feedlots, which is the only option that these farmers have, or invest the support in managing and maintaining them going forward. In relation to the badger vaccination, the IFA position on that is reserved for the moment, considering the experience of Monaghan. What has been clearly very effective has been the reduction in the numbers of badgers throughout the country and has significantly contributed to the health status of the badger as a result since the early 2000s. And it is hoped that vaccination will be the next phase. But we would be concerned, based on the experience in Monaghan that continues for the past 18 months to 2 years, with little indication of a significant improvement. We have asked for a detailed analysis of the situation there. We've asked for a detailed investigation to identify what has contributed to it, because unfortunately that area is consistent with the vaccination area in that county, or the most difficult part of it at that point. In relation to the pre-movement test, just for a point of clarity, it's an EU proposal, Deputy, in relation to probably the clearest herds in the country, because if you and you understand how the TB programme works, if you're in a problem area, you're in a 4-month test cycle anyway. This actually EU proposal precludes any of those herds from having to do that. So effectively the highest risk areas in the country aren't required under this EU proposal to do a pre-movement test. But the lowest incidence areas of the country, where you're only testing once a year, you have no TB breakdowns, you're not contiguous, you now are exposed to a pre-movement test obligation. The Department's own figures show that only 7.5% of breakdowns in the country annually are related to animal movements. So we would be concerned as to the return on investment of potentially up to 20 million in that regard on a pre-movement test, when we're looking for significantly less that to address the compensatory deficiencies, which will allow us to put in place meaningful measures in the problem areas to address this in the 10-year window that has been set out. Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Farrell.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. There is no doubt that the TB programme has cost an enormous amount, both to farmers in the state since it started. And I just took down a few figures. We came from a high of 110,000 reactors in '65 down to 01 when the wildlife programme was implemented of 40,000 reactors a year, and we're now down to 15,000. There seems to be a reluctance by the department at the TB forum to deal with some of our issues. And as Tomas has said, all the farm bodies asked them, could it be front-loaded, because if the objective was to get rid of TB by 2030, surely it was going to cost less from 25 to 2030, and that money could be front-loaded in the programme. There was a total reluctance by the department to do that, even though the costs and benefits would decide who was going to pay what into the programme. And we found that as farming representatives incredible. And for that reason, because our issues haven't been addressed, we haven't given our blessing to the interim report. But the TB forum seems to have gone ahead without us anyway. Just to get into some of the detail, inconclusives. The department were asked, well, if these inconclusives are such a problem, take them out and compensate the farmer. Total reluctance again by the department to do that. So, to me, the department aren't serious about getting rid of the disease, because if there's problems and they're leaving them behind, it's only going to surface down the road. Just on the badger vaccination, there were 6 pilot areas in the country. Monaghan was one of them, and it was the area that exploded in TB. And it was interesting to note, after a while, the TB cleared quicker in the areas outside the vaccination area than inside it. So for that reason, we'd have a reluctance to give our blessing to the vaccination, because there's something going on. If badgers are vaccinated in the area, but yet the area that's beside it that was equally as bad with TB seems to be clearing the TB quicker than the vaccinated area, well, that has to be explained, and it hasn't been explained.
Okay.